Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to be covering the topic of immigration. Not modern immigration, but what we'll term the new immigration. That was the immigration that took place between 1870 and roughly 1920, tapering off right around 1919, 1920. Well, actually slowing down a bit during the interwar years, the war years of World War One. Roughly 1914 to 1920, tapering off during those years. But before we begin our lecture proper on the new immigration or immigration in the 19th century, I like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we were completing our analysis of the populist movement, how it was mainly an agrarian movement, solidly based in the farming communities of the Midwestern plains, those newly settled areas like the plains of Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas, and so forth, pushing into the areas that were taken from the plains natives. We also looked at the great analogy of the election of 1896, The Wizard of Oz, how Frank Baum actually did a quite masterful job in using his main character to represent the main figures in the populist movement. You had the Cowardly Lion, of course, being William Jennings Bryan. There's this very powerful figure with a very deep roar, the roar being his rhetoric, but with no courage. He didn't have the courage to actually stand with the populace as a whole, and he decided to run as a mainstream candidate, thinking that was a better shot for him to achieve office. And of course, the wizard, this person who seems all powerful but really just a little man on a bicycle behind the curtain, is a reference or an analogy to the eventual winner of the election of 1896, William McKinley. And of course, the scarecrow and the Tin Man represent both the farmer having no brain because he doesn't realize what he has to do to protect himself, and of course the Tin Man having no heart because he cannot empathize and side with the farmers in this struggle. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture for today, the new immigration. And to begin with, in the late 19th century, there were a number of let's call them embellished tales circulating in Europe about the United States and the promise and the opportunities that awaited new immigrants in the United States. Many people told of the young dream, the riches, the openness, the freeness that awaited new immigrants upon arrival. Now, had conditions for farmers worsened in Europe, many immigrated to the United States, particularly from Great Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. Many Russian Jews also immigrated due to Tsarist policies targeting Jewish populations. At this time in Russia, there was an official policy of Tsarism, orthodoxy, and Russification. And all of these were, and that program itself was mainly targeted towards the Poles, the Finns, and the Jews living in Russia. They were attempting to break down Polish culture, Finnish culture, and Jewish culture, and have just one culture. One country, one Tsar, one religion, one people. That was the main objectives of this Russian program. So many of the Russian Jews simply left. The Poles left because of that, and also because of bad conditions in Poland. Slavs from southeastern Europe left. The Irish, of course, were coming in droves even after the Great Famine had ended. But during the Great Famine in particular, many immigrated out to Canada, Australia, other British colonies, and of course the United States. And that number continued to swell. More and more continued to arrive from Ireland. Italians were coming and Greeks were coming. And many of these groups were new immigrants. They had never really been in large numbers. They had never really been in any kind of number in the United States. And because they had never been population density in the United States, because they'd never been members of the ethnic group in the United States before. They brought in their cultures, their religions, their foods, and their social beliefs into the United States, and this led to a number of ethnic enclaves, these multi-ethnic districts in a lot of the cities on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. Places like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, they became really well known. Particularly New York became really well known for their little Italies, or the little Germany, or the little Poland, the little wherever, Greek town, all sorts of things like that. They became well known for those things, for those ethnic enclaves. But the immigrants themselves, as soon as they arrived, they began to lay the foundation. They began to try, or for themselves, or to enable their children to climb the American ladder, to climb that American ladder to respectability and prosperity. And mainly they used public schools. Public schools were really becoming instituted at this time, and the immigrants saw education as a way to enrich and better their children's lives. And of course, government officials saw this as a way of Americanization for the immigrant families, and especially the immigrant children. Teaching English became a major emphasis. It wasn't completely dominant, because we still had at this time long-standing French and Spanish-speaking, and of course German-speaking communities that openly used their mother tongues, the tongues of their ancestors. Even still in areas in New York where the old Dutch lived, many people still spoke old Dutch. Many people still use Dutch as their personal language, their first language. But nonetheless, for this new wave of immigrants, the government officials and so forth, and people are really concerned with the civic ordering of the American Republic, thought of using or intended to use schools and education as a way of teaching English and American values to immigrants' children. Now, many people did not cotton to these new immigrants. This melting pot outlook of continually swung between an anti-immigrant stance that warned of race suicide and led to immigration bans and quota policies. The motivation for immigration, the motivations are not really altogether understood. No one really knows why the people left. We can say that, but we can say that they wanted better opportunities, and some did. But a number at this time didn't really put down permanent roots in the United States. They came and left, whenever they felt the economic incentive to come to the United States. It is clear, though, that a set of circumstances relating to the lack of prosperity in Europe and a desire for opportunity in the United States really spurred the immigration of mass Europeans at the time to the United States. Race rationamical, best estimates, and these are still rough estimates, because at this time there's not really a lot of concrete record keeping from this time for immigrants, but the best estimates are that an average of about 1 million immigrants per year were arriving to the United States. And it should be noted that this immigration from Europe to the United States was a part of a larger worldwide migration or diaspora of European peoples to the Americas, and also to Africa and to Asia. Incidentally, there was a migration of people leaving China and coming to the Western United States too, and we will also address the Chinese immigration. Now, different groups of immigrants had better rates of success than others. British immigrants, for example, had a better success ratio than nearly all other immigrant groups combined. Now, this is because they shared the same language and nearly the same culture as many of the old stock Americans. They also found work relatively easy, being familiar with industrial or factory work. Now, Russian, Chinese, and Italian immigrants, they had a tougher time assimilating into American culture. Many were fleeing prosecution. About 2,000 Jews were expelled from Moscow and St. Petersburg alone due to those Russification policies. World economic competition also played a major role in the decision to immigrate. For example, in southern Italy, Italian citrus farmers were facing increased global competition from Florida and California citrus growers. And rather than stay in Italy and compete, many opted to simply immigrate to Florida and to California instead, and to join the local citrus industries in those states. Now, early on, this new immigration was welcomed in the Republic. And really immortalized by a poem written by Emma Lazarus in 1883. The poem was placed on a plaque on the Statue of Liberty, and the Statue of Liberty itself was a gift from France to the United States in honor of the 1876 centennial. Now, the statue, however, was not sent over and assembled until 1886, so the plaque was placed, after the poem was written. Now, Lazarus herself, Emma Lazarus, she was a fourth-generation Jewish immigrant, and so she rightly understood. Her grandparents were the children of immigrants. Her parents were the grandchildren of immigrants. So she had a personal connection to the immigrant story. Sort of tragically, Lazarus herself, she died a year after the Statue of Liberty was assembled. But her poem was placed on the stack in 1903, and it's called The New Colossus. It's one of the masterpieces of American literature, American poetry. The New Colossus contrasts the United States and other empires or large political entities in history, and really the outlooks of those large polities, and creates a mood of welcome and acceptance, or at least projects that mood of welcome and acceptance in the United States. A new type of national monument for a new type of nation. Many people view it as that. And expertly captured in Lazarus' words, "Give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Very powerful words in the late 19th century, and very powerful words even now in the early 21st century. Now, one reason for this open arms approach to immigration was that in many parts of the country, labor was extremely scarce. Now, this allowed new immigrants who were going to be wage earners to receive much higher pay than they would have received if they had stayed in Europe. Immigration was really an expensive endeavor. The poorest of Europe's huddled masses were really unable to leave and go to the United States. Transatlantic voyaging in the 19th century was still, a costly affair. By the turn of the 20th century, though, industrial improvements and better business plans had made travel and immigration much more affordable. The journey had really been reduced from months to a week. And new travel options were also allowed for industrial wage earners. You could now travel steerage. And even now, like you see a lot of old pictures where people huddled on the decks and so forth. That's steerage. Many people could travel steerage. You'd be exposed to the elements, but it was reduced fare. Sometimes you may have to perform service duties on the ship, but it was a way for entire family units to stay together. Parents, maybe even siblings, large family structures like a couple with their adult children, spouses, and their grandchildren all moving together. Steerage allowed for family units like that to travel. Now the journey also didn't allow for impoverished family units, but it also made for regular journeys. It gave rise to what we call birds of passage. Now, birds of passage were people who immigrated to the United States and immigrated, and then not even immigrated, simply came over for seasonal work in the United States and then went back home. Some immigrated and worked for a few years, Maybe they work for a 5-year period and then take the money they earned here and go back home. Some would spend their entire wage earning years, all of their prime age, their prime wage earning years in the United States, and simply would go back home once they reach the age of retirement. And of course, as I said earlier, some would simply come over when work was slow in their homelands or when manual labor was really needed in the United States. They would sort of pick the seasons, coming over for the summer work and so forth, for spring and summer work, and heading back home in the fall and the winter. Now, New York City was the major hub for immigration. And there are 2 locations associated with the city's immigration history. One would be Castle Garden, and her replacement, Ellis Island. Now, new arrivals to Ellis Island were subject to various health checks for things like eye disease, mental illness, and lameness. There was a very conscious effort to keep those people out, and they would put these big chalk letters on you. Or pin pieces of paper with the letter on you, and that would sort of mark you out as not being acceptable, and you would simply be forced to try to find a way back home. You'd also have lice checks. They would also check people for lice, which was a common epidemic at the time. Now, there was also an intelligence test. Now, immigration screening was a very tense moment. About 1 in 10 potential European immigrants failed and were barred admission to the Republic. New immigrants tended to cluster together in those ethnic enclaves, those little Italies, little Polands and so forth, Greek towns and so forth. And New York City, again, provides a great example of this. Has ethnic groups often settled together and jostled around one another. Recent immigrants at first expressed what we call an intense localism. Localism would be, for example, Saxons grouping themselves apart from Bavarians, or Tuscans remaining aloof from Sicilians. Pretending to only associate, preferring to cluster around people from their Pacific region, the Pacific region that they immigrated from. But over time, that localism sort of faded away, and many immigrants simply embraced a broader national identity and identified and settled in areas marked as a German neighborhood or an Italian neighborhood. They found solidarity in the Republic, at being strangers in a strange land. They found solidarity in a shared language, culture, and customs. Now, another issue for the immigrants was that what was really overcoming the language barrier. Now, as I said earlier, some didn't really have any difficulty. British immigrants, Irish immigrants didn't face that sort of difficulty because, again, they're coming with an understanding of English. They're coming with the ability to speak English. For Germans and Poles, Slavs, Italians, with no sort of background in English, it was difficult. It was a very difficult hurdle to overcome, and many never did. Many were largely relegated to immigrant ghettos. Some people never learned. There's still stories. Maybe some families have stories about a grandmother or a grandfather, particularly a grandmother, who maybe never really left her neighborhood. The religious center she went to spoke in her native language. All the people in the neighborhood she spoke to spoke her language. The grocer she went to spoke her language. In the neighborhood, all the signs were in her language. In her household, she spoke to her house, or in your household, you would speak to your spouse, your children, in your language. In some communities, the need never really developed for some people to learn English, but for a lot of the men, a lot of the industrial workers, people who went out and worked in the factories and so forth, and the shops, the need for English was undeniable. And again, the children were all taught English in the schools. But it was largely the children, as I stated earlier, being sent to the public schools that learned English, and because English was explicitly used in the schools, this allowed for a very unique circumstance to develop, where children would end up teaching their parents the English. They would serve as translators to their parents. And industrial discipline was another area where recent immigrants, particularly rural immigrants, really struggled to adapt. Rural workers were accustomed to the pace or were really unaccustomed to the pace and the duties of factory work. It was quite difficult to develop the rhythm for industrial. It is quite difficult even now to develop a rhythm to industrial work. Cultural practices had to be amended to fit in with the industrial schedule. You know, with farming, it can be really more relaxed. It can only be really hectic during the planting phase of agriculture, and of course the harvesting phase of agriculture. The other days you can sort of have like a relaxed atmosphere with it, and of course for Catholic countries, for Orthodox countries, you are not going to get, you know, all those saint days. Either Orthodox saints or Catholic saints, you weren't going to get those days off. So you had to sort of really sort of acclimate yourself to to what the factory owners, the factory bosses wanted from you. Also little traditions and so forth. So like a rural Polish wedding, for example, went on for like 5 days. You were not going to get 5 days off for a wedding. You know, you might not even get the day off for the wedding. Your wedding might have to be in the middle of the day. Your wedding might have to be at night. Brisk, for example, Jewish males often, well, not often, they sort of mandated that they undergo the brisk, the circumcision ceremony. It typically takes place about a week or so after the birth of the male. You're not going to get time off in the middle of the day to do that. So they had to sort of alter their cultural their sort of cultural patterns to fit in with industrialized work, with standardized American industrialized work. But even with all that, the immigrants themselves, they took it as a sort of necessary step to climb the ladders of success. They all believed that that those embellished tales were going to come true for them. They all believed that individually they would all reap the economic prosperity and achieve the greatness that Andrew Carnegie had achieved. And to be certain, Andrew Carnegie's rag to riches story is one in a million. Most immigrants did not become overwhelmingly rich. Over time, these immigrant families did become members of the American middle class. The families were not going to be the uber wealthy, the multimillionaires of society. They were going to be members of the solidly members of the middle class of the United States. And this was typically achieved by the second or the third generation of these immigrant families. And with that being said, I'd like to break here, and we will come back with part 2 of our lecture on immigration, or the new immigration, and round things off. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time.